Dawn broke over the Pacific in April of 1944 with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. The water, pale and unbroken, stretched to the horizon, and yet beneath that placid surface, an unseen American hunter moved with purpose. No smoke trailed behind it, no shadow marked its presence. To the Japanese sailors, the morning seemed ordinary, but in truth, the ordinary had already abandoned them. Reports began filtering through the fleet. Convoys that should have arrived intact were simply gone. No radio calls, no distress signals, no drifting lifeboats, only silence. Survivors, when they could be found, spoke of torpedoes that struck without warning, that vanished into the sea as if the ocean itself had swallowed them. Ships that had sailed with confidence the day before were now missing, leaving only the faint memory of their existence in logs and dispatches. By noon, the commanders could no longer ignore the pattern. Entire shipping lanes, arteries of men and materiel, were collapsing overnight. Admiral after admiral convened in hushed rooms, their faces lit by maps and the faint glow of plotting tables. They whispered almost fearfully that something had changed beneath the waves, that the rules of engagement no longer applied. What they confronted was not a fleet, but an absence, a void in the water that killed with surgical precision. Meanwhile, in the quiet, American submarine logs chronicled the destruction with the cool detachment of surgeons. Each entry cataloged tonnage sunk, coordinates of attacks, the depth and angle of torpedo strikes. There was no bravado in these pages, only the meticulous record of a weapon perfected in shadow. And yet, beneath the clinical language, there was a pulse, a rhythm of inevitability that the Japanese forces would soon sense but could neither see nor counter. By nightfall, Japan understood, in fragments and whispers, that its most formidable threat was invisible, intangible, and relentless. The sea itself had become a weapon, and the hunters it concealed were patient, calculating, and unyielding. They had entered a new era of naval warfare, one that would make the proudest ships of the empire vanish as if they had never been built. But what they didn't know was that this hunter, silent and unseen, would soon redefine the very rules of war, setting the stage for a reckoning that neither doctrine nor courage could forestall. By 1944, Japan's war machine was a network of steel and sea, dependent on some 6,000 merchant ships that threaded across the Pacific like veins carrying lifeblood. Each vessel was a promise. Coal, rubber, rice, oil, and steel ferried from distant colonies to the home islands. The Imperial Navy, confident in its prowess, believed that a shield of destroyers and escorts would suffice to protect these fragile arteries. Confidence, however, had a cost. Early war doctrine painted a comforting picture. American submarines were slow, unwieldy, and unsophisticated. Intelligence reports assured them that these predators could be tracked, anticipated, and avoided. Admirals poured resources into battleships, carriers, and cruiser squadrons, viewing the vast stretches of ocean as a chessboard where decisive fleet engagements would determine the war's outcome. Anti-submarine measures were considered secondary, a necessary nuisance rather than a priority. Convoys, in the view of the Navy, were almost dishonorable. Independence, audacity, and speed were the hallmarks of a proud seafaring tradition. Merchant vessels sailed alone or in loosely organized groups, their captains emboldened by doctrine and the assumption that Japanese skill could outmatch American cunning. They carried the empire's hopes, often unaware that each voyage increased their vulnerability. The home islands, particularly Tokyo and Osaka, depended entirely on oil shipped from the Dutch East Indies. One fragile lifeline threaded thousands of miles through waters now teeming with unseen predators. No Japanese planner envisioned this lifeline severed not by massed fleets or aerial bombardment, but by stealth, patience, and precision. Less than 300 American submarines, moving like ghosts beneath the waves, would soon impose a quiet, devastating calculus upon the empire. And yet, in the confident halls of naval command, there was little anticipation of the scale of destruction to come. The men who had trained their eyes on battleships could not see the submarine lurking in shadows, the weapon that would silently unpick the threads of an empire's supply lines. What seemed secure, what had seemed inviolable, was about to vanish, leaving Japan to confront the ocean not as a conduit of power, but as an unforgiving arbiter of fate. But what they didn't know was that every ship that sailed alone brought them closer to the brink of starvation, a silence at sea that would echo through the islands with merciless precision. In the opening months of 1942, American submariners stalked the Pacific with eagerness and precision, yet their weapons betrayed them. The Mark 14 torpedo, engineered for speed and deadly accuracy, failed in nearly half of all attacks. Warships that should have sunk limped away, leaving captains to return frustrated, their reports filled with duds, misfires, and circular runs that sometimes struck their own vessels. Each mission ended with silent humiliation, a promise of vengeance deferred. Japanese commanders observed these early encounters with measured satisfaction. The unexploded torpedoes, the erratic detonations, seemed to confirm the old assumptions. The Americans were technically weak, unprepared, and incapable of sustaining a lethal submarine campaign. Admirals interpreted mechanical failure as proof of incompetence rather than a temporary defect, their confidence in unescorted shipping reinforced by luck and circumstance. Convoys continued, and Japan's lifelines remained, for the moment, intact. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, U.S. naval leadership struggled with denial. Investigations into the Mark 14's performance were slow and reluctant. Technical flaws were dismissed, blamed on crews, on circumstances, on chance. Precious months slipped by as the weapon remained faulty, even as captains learned to improvise, testing torpedoes against cliffs and isolated targets to confirm suspicions of malfunction. In hushed tones and under cover of routine exercises, these silent experiments revealed a fatal truth. The torpedo was broken, but repair was possible. The irony was stark. What had saved Japan, a combination of engineering failure and bureaucratic inaction, would soon be reversed. Once the torpedoes were corrected, American submarines gained a precision and lethality that Japanese planners could not anticipate. The same shipping lanes that had seemed secure, the convoys that had sailed with near impunity, would become conduits of destruction. Each vessel lost, each cargo destroyed, would mark the passage from confidence to catastrophe. And yet, in the quiet offices of Tokyo and Osaka, no one imagined that a single weapon, once fully functional, could so decisively unpick the empire's carefully laid plans. What seemed like incompetence was merely the calm before a storm that would sweep across the Pacific with silent inevitability. But what they didn't know was that the torpedoes, once fixed, would transform from unreliable instruments into the invisible arbiters of Japan's supply line, heralding losses that could no fleet nor fleet commander hope to reverse. By the summer of 1943, a quiet transformation rippled beneath the Pacific surface. The Mark 14 torpedoes, long plagued by duds and erratic runs, began to behave as intended. Ships that had previously survived their encounters with American submarines now found themselves under precise, unerring attack. Japanese escort captains, once complacent in the confidence of early war success, were jolted by torpedoes striking where no vessel should have been vulnerable. The shock of sudden accuracy reverberated across the fleet, shaking assumptions that had seemed immutable. American commanders of the silent service recognized the window that history had granted them. Aggressive patrol patterns replaced cautious observation. Submarines hunted in depth, shadowing convoys for days, striking at night when their targets were blind to the danger lurking below. Radar and sonar, technologies still novel in 1943, granted these boats a spectral advantage, the ability to navigate the darkness and strike with lethal precision. The ocean, once a vast expanse of uncertainty, became a controlled environment, where training, patience, and technology amplified the small crews into forces capable of reshaping the war. The adoption of wolfpack tactics, groups of submarines coordinating attacks, borrowed from the lessons of the German U-boats in the Atlantic, but with one critical difference. Losses among American submarines remained comparatively low, thanks to disciplined evasion and superior intelligence. Japan's responses, meanwhile, lagged behind. Destroyers relied on hydrophones that could barely detect submarines beyond a few hundred yards, depth charges that were often set to explode too shallow or too deep. Each failed countermeasure allowed American submariners to see the Pacific as a hunter's ocean, populated by vessels too slow, too predictable, and dangerously overconfident. The shift in fortune was nearly invisible to Tokyo. Convoys continued, seemingly secure, while the true scale of destruction remained obscured beneath the waves. Yet the damage curves began to rise exponentially, tonnage lost mounting month by month. Each sunken freighter, each critical shipment of oil or raw materials, quietly tightened the noose around Japan's logistical network. Admirals debated strategy, yet they lacked the data to understand the emerging pattern. The war at sea was no longer symmetrical. The hunter had become invisible, and the hunted remained unaware of the growing threat until it was too late. For submarine crews, the Pacific was a realm of endless opportunity. Patrol logs read like maps of predation, coordinates and tonnage meticulously recorded, yet beneath the clinical precision lay a quiet moral tension. Every sinking was measured, every life at sea acknowledged, but the imperative of war left little room for sentiment. The ocean had become both stage and instrument, shaping victory with subtle inevitability. And yet in the corridors of Japanese command, there was only confidence and tradition. What seemed routine, what had seemed like minor losses, was already a prelude to catastrophe. The invisible tide below the waves had begun its inexorable rise, and the Empire's lifelines were now threading through a graveyard it could neither see nor stop. But what they didn't know was that the ocean itself had turned against them, and the hunter lurking beneath it would soon dictate the Empire's survival or ruin. When Japan entered the Pacific War, it did so with a critical vulnerability that few at the time fully recognized: a profound lack of anti-submarine capability. Convoy discipline was minimal. Merchant vessels sailed independently or in loose formations, their captains relying on speed and tradition rather than coordinated protection. This independence, long celebrated as a virtue, left vital shipping lanes exposed, threading the Empire's lifeblood through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Destroyers, the supposed guardians of these arteries, were ill-equipped for the underwater threat. Sonar, then a relatively new technology, was scarce and rudimentary. Japanese escort vessels, designed for surface engagements and traditional gunnery, could hear approaching submarines only in fragments, if at all. Air patrols, critical in the Atlantic for detecting and deterring enemy submarines, remained thin, scattered, and poorly coordinated across the vast Pacific. Opportunities to intercept or deter attacks were fleeting, wasted by inadequate reconnaissance and a doctrinal blind spot. Training emphasized surface combat and the glory of fleet engagements. Crews drilled with guns, torpedoes, and maneuvers designed to outfight other ships, not to detect a predator lurking beneath the waves. Depth charges, the primary weapon against submarines, were often set too shallow, detonating above or beside their targets. Ammunition and effort were squandered while the true threat slipped unseen beneath the keel. Early successes bred confidence, masking the widening vulnerability that would soon grow into catastrophic losses. Even experienced destroyer crews, hardened in the early campaigns of the Pacific, were lost to the unforgiving combination of American stealth and insufficient anti-submarine doctrine. Their replacements, when they came, could not match their skill or intuition. Knowledge was irreplaceable, and the absence of institutional memory only magnified the Empire's blind spots. Every sunk convoy, every missed detection, widened the wound beneath the ocean's surface, though Tokyo remained largely unaware of its depth. Escort carriers, which in the Atlantic had become essential for convoy defense, were almost non-existent in the Pacific. Without air cover to track and attack submarines, the sea itself became a lethal theater, dominated by American hunters who could strike with impunity. Japan's logistical lifelines, once assumed secure, became conduits of vulnerability. The Empire's confidence persisted even as its losses silently mounted, recorded only in scattered reports and partial intelligence, often dismissed as anomalies rather than harbingers. By late 1943, the pattern was unmistakable to any observer in the silent service. Japan's strategic blind spot had become a gaping wound. Convoys sank at an accelerating pace, tonnage lost mounting as submarines exploited the gaps in detection, coordination, and technology. The Empire, proud and confident on the surface, remained almost entirely blind to the enemy below. But what they didn't know was that the hunter lurking beneath every convoy would continue to strike with relentless patience, turning the Pacific into a graveyard for ships and supplies that no surface skill or bravery could fully protect. By mid-1943, the silent service had begun to evolve from a fledgling, tentative force into a precise instrument of war. Commanders like Dudley "Mush" Morton rewrote the rules of submarine doctrine, discarding cautious patrol patterns in favor of audacity and initiative. The timid orders that had governed early campaigns, restrained attacks, avoidance of surface engagement, gave way to a philosophy that embraced the hunter's role fully. Submarines no longer waited for opportunity, they created it. These boats became predators in a vast and hostile ocean. Night attacks, once considered reckless, became a defining tactic. Surface assaults under the cover of darkness caught Japanese escort captains off guard, leaving their gunnery crews scrambling in confusion. The combination of audacious maneuvering and calculated aggression meant that every patrol could yield catastrophic results for convoys that had once sailed with confidence. Radar, still a new tool, allowed American submarines to strike without ever revealing themselves, plotting approaches and firing solutions in silence while the enemy remained blind to their presence. Japanese convoys, forced to adapt, tightened their formations in a desperate attempt at defense. Yet, in doing so, they created denser targets, presenting a concentrated grid for the American submarines to exploit. Each vessel that had once been isolated and independent now became part of a formation that amplified its vulnerability. Submarine crews learned to anticipate enemy reactions, timing attacks to exploit every predictable maneuver, while honing their evasion tactics to survive depth-charge storms. Calm, precise, and unflinching, they moved through the chaos with a discipline that made their strikes almost inevitable. Over months, this patient, methodical approach transformed the war beneath the waves into a new kind of warfare, mathematical in its rigor, patient in its observation, and merciless in its execution. The Pacific became a theater of numbers and probability, where every approach, every firing solution, every evasive maneuver was calculated to maximize destruction while minimizing risk. The art of killing became as much about anticipation as execution, a discipline born of both engineering and instinct. For Japan, the shift remained largely invisible at first. Ships still sailed with the assumption that their luck and training could carry them through, that earlier patterns of survival would persist. And yet, the rising tide of losses told a different story, one of an empire being dissected by a force that operated in silence, measured in tonnage sunk and miles patrolled, leaving little room for heroism, only precision. But what they didn't know was that these newly forged hunters had only begun to learn their craft, and that the ocean, once a neutral expanse, had been claimed by men who would turn every voyage into a test of patience, skill, and inevitability. By 1943, the Bungo and Makassar Straits, narrow arteries linking resource-rich colonies to the Japanese home islands, had become vital lifelines, and the Americans recognized them as pressure points that could decide the Pacific War. Submarines were dispatched with surgical intent, assigned to patrol, intercept, and choke these passages where oil, rubber, and raw materials flowed with relentless urgency. The straits were constricted, predictable, and yet deadly. A slow tanker, once a mundane target, became a moving prize worth weeks of patience and risk. Japanese convoy commanders, well aware of the growing menace, pleaded for air cover that rarely arrived. Patrol aircraft were thin, overstretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Escorts tried to maintain formation, yet the narrow waters left them exposed. Convoys, so crucial to the empire's survival, were forced into a cruel calculus: move quickly and risk detection, or slow down and invite annihilation. The men on deck could hear nothing but the steady slap of water, unaware of the predators that had already counted their ship's ribs beneath the waves. American wolf packs coordinated with meticulous discipline. Radio silence was observed rigorously, each boat aware of the other's patrol zones and attack windows. Attacks were planned over hours, sometimes days, taking advantage of predictable schedules, moonlight, and the enemy's own sense of routine. When the moment came, it was executed with a quiet ferocity. Torpedoes struck with unerring precision, and Japanese tankers, slow and nearly irreplaceable, were ripped from the ocean like lifelines severed at the source. Every sinking was catalogued, every escape noted, yet the process remained devoid of spectacle, efficient, almost clinical, a quiet calculus of destruction. Japan attempted to respond. Counter-submarine mines were laid in an effort to trap and destroy the intruders. But inexperience, miscommunication, and the vastness of the ocean meant that entire fields were misplaced or left incomplete. Where defenses existed, they were insufficient. Where they were absent, they proved lethal in ways the Japanese could not anticipate. Submariners, in turn, learned to navigate these hazards, slipping through minefields with careful observation, charts updated from previous encounters, and an unshakable calm. Life aboard American submarines was a test of endurance and discipline. Tropical heat pressed against steel hulls, carbon dioxide levels crept upward in the enclosed compartments, and the silence, punctuated only by distant sonar echoes or the faint hum of the diesel engine, became both companion and tormentor. Crews slept in shifts, ate sparingly, and remained vigilant for hours that bled into days, understanding that survival depended not on speed, but patience, on timing, and on mastery of the unseen environment. The straits themselves became arenas of psychological warfare. Ships and submarines danced an invisible ballet, each maneuver, each pause, each depth adjustment a decision between life and death. Japanese sailors clung to hope and training, but hope alone could not protect them from the patient, calculating hunters beneath the waves. Losses mounted, tonnage lost accelerated, and the empire's vital lifelines were slowly strangled. By the end of 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. The Pacific was no longer merely contested. It was a domain dominated by an invisible hand, by submariners who had mastered endurance, strategy, and the mathematics of killing. The Bungo and Macassar Straits, once secure corridors, had become proving grounds for a new form of warfare, precise, patient, and merciless. But what they didn't know was that every convoy sent through these waters carried not only fuel and food, but the weight of an empire's survival, and that the hunters beneath the waves had only begun to tighten their grip. By 1944, the technological gulf between the U.S. fleet submarines and their Japanese counterparts had become decisive. American boats arrived at the theater with air conditioning to withstand tropical heat, batteries capable of longer, deeper patrols, and engines that delivered both speed and quiet endurance. These innovations were not mere conveniences. They were instruments of survival and lethality, allowing submariners to operate farther, longer, and more efficiently than any opponent could hope to match. Long-range endurance transformed the Pacific into a hunting ground without borders. A single submarine could patrol thousands of miles, shadow convoys across entire archipelagos, and strike at multiple targets before needing to resupply. Japanese captains, constrained by shorter ranges and fuel limitations, could only guess where the enemy might appear. Every patrol represented a chessboard where the Americans moved multiple pieces in secrecy, while Japan's fleet remained anchored in doctrine, strategy, and outdated hardware. Firing solutions, once the domain of painstaking manual calculation, became instantaneous through the use of torpedo data computers. A submarine captain could calculate angle, speed, and depth in seconds, allowing torpedoes to strike with an almost preternatural accuracy. Japanese escorts, by contrast, relied on manual plotting and delayed reactions, their countermeasures perpetually a step behind. Where Japan's responses lagged, American submarines executed with the quiet precision of engineers and mathematicians, turning probability into inevitability. Radar extended this advantage further. Convoys, once thought safe beyond the horizon, could now be detected while still hundreds of miles away. Japanese forces lacked equivalent technology. They could only react when disaster had already arrived, their perception always delayed, their strategy perpetually defensive. Every convoy that sailed was an open invitation, every night a testing ground for American technological supremacy. Beneath this technological edge lay another, less visible weapon: intelligence. Ultra intercepts quietly fed U.S. submarines the movements of Japanese shipping. Routes, schedules, and priorities were observed in real time, allowing commanders to anticipate, position, and strike with foreknowledge. This invisible hand, combined with mechanical superiority, transformed American submarines from individual warships into a coherent, lethal system, one that Japan could neither match nor comprehend until it was too late. The realization dawned slowly, almost painfully, across Japanese command. Ships that had once moved with confidence now vanished with alarming frequency. Entire lines of supply, entire lifelines of fuel and raw materials, were cut down not by superior numbers, nor by overwhelming firepower, but by a combination of endurance, technology, and calculation. What Japan had considered mere vessels in the ocean were revealed to be integrated systems, orchestrated to exploit every weakness in an empire unprepared for the scale of the threat. The irony was striking. The hunters had become architects, engineers of war as much as warriors, and their adversary had been slow to recognize the scope of the system arrayed against them. Every sinking was precise, every patrol deliberate, yet the consequences rippled far beyond individual encounters. Logistics, strategy, morale, and the survival of the home islands were all quietly reshaped by boats that appeared small, insignificant, and unthreatening when first sighted. By the end of 1944, Japan could no longer see the war in the Pacific as a contest of ships and gunners alone. It was a contest of systems, endurance, and information, and in all three categories, the silent service held the advantage. The ocean had become a domain of invisible mass. Uri, where each American submarine was a node in a network of lethal inevitability, turning traditional naval engagement into a mathematical, mechanical, and patient form of destruction. But what they didn't know was that these systems had only begun to flex their power, and that the Empire's lifelines, once considered secure, were now conduits for a quiet, relentless attrition that no ship, escort, or convoy could ultimately withstand. By late 1944, the scale of Japan's maritime disaster was undeniable. Over half of the Empire's merchant fleet now rested at the bottom of the ocean, sunk by American submarines that moved with quiet inevitability. Each loss was meticulously logged in the Silent Service's patrol reports, a grim ledger of tonnage destroyed. But for the Japanese command, the full scope remained almost unimaginable. What had begun as isolated sinkings had metastasized into systemic annihilation, a slow but relentless attrition that stripped the Empire of its lifeblood. Coal, once delivered in quantities sufficient to fuel the factories of Tokyo and Osaka, arrived in meager shipments, barely enough to keep machinery moving. Steel mills ground to intermittent halts, and the hum of industrial productivity faded to intermittent sparks and echoes. Civilians felt the consequences immediately. Rations tightened, staples vanished from markets, and the diet that had sustained a nation through the early years of war became a series of compromises. Hunger, a shadow previously confined to distant colonies, crept into the home islands. Military garrisons scattered across the Pacific Islands fared no better. Outposts on Truk, the Marianas, and the Dutch East Indies became isolated, awaiting supplies that never arrived. Engineers, artillery units, and infantry regiments rationed fuel, ammunition, and food, their operations curtailed by absence rather than combat. Island strongholds, once thought impregnable, now teetered on the edge of starvation, their morale eroding silently, almost invisibly, to the Americans watching from beneath the waves. Aircraft production faltered as aluminum, fuel, and essential components failed to reach the factories. Flight lines slowed, test squadrons shrank. Training programs once measured in hours were now reduced to minutes per pilot. Young aviators, pressed into service with only a fragment of preparation, faced the front lines with inadequate skill and dwindling confidence. Japan's once robust aerial arm, the pride of the empire, was now limited by logistics more than enemy action. Every ship lost was more than a single vessel. Each sinking dismantled the intricate latticework of an industrial economy built for total war. Factories paused, fuel depots dwindled, and production quotas became unattainable. In tandem, the empire's strategic mobility shrank. Troop deployments, reinforcements, and supplies, all reliant on maritime transport, became increasingly sporadic and uncertain. The Silent Service, operating from shadows, had struck not just at ships, but at the very capacity of Japan to sustain its military and civilian war effort. The effect was cumulative and exponential. The merchant fleet, once the circulatory system of an empire, had been reduced to fragments, leaving vital arteries severed. Coal, oil, aluminum, food, and raw materials, a constellation of lifelines, had been disrupted simultaneously. Factories, garrisons, and cities felt the absence like a slow pulse fading into silence. Japan's industrial momentum, the engine that had sustained early victories and ambitious offensives, faltered under the weight of systematic deprivation. By the end of 1944, the empire faced a stark reckoning. Ships that had sailed with confidence months earlier were gone. Supply lines, once taken for granted, had been annihilated. Civilians, soldiers, and planners alike were forced to confront the consequences of underestimating a foe who had turned endurance, intelligence, and technology into instruments of invisible domination. But what they didn't know was that the destruction of shipping was only the beginning, a prelude to a strategic collapse that would strip Japan of choice, leaving its cities, armies, and industry vulnerable to the inexorable designs of an enemy who had mastered the art of total war beneath the waves. By early 1945, Japan's strategic situation had reached a point of desperation. The empire, once proud and confident on the seas, was running on fumes, literally. A final, audacious counterattack was planned, centered on the battleship Yamato, the largest vessel ever built by the Japanese Navy. She was to be the spearhead of a strike designed to disrupt the Allied advance, a last gesture of naval defiance. The plan, Operation Tengo, promised nothing short of heroism, though few involved expected survival. Weeks before the sortie, American submarines had already struck decisively. Few
Andrew ran a hand through his hair, wild and panicked. I know, yes, she just, look, I'm trying to protect my dad. He promised me things. He owed me. You don't understand. The judge leaned back. Mr. Jennings, you've provided no proof of any promise, but we do have proof of theft, coercion, and attempts to deceive this court. Andrew's breath quickened. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. That was when Walt finally spoke. He rose only slightly enough for his voice to carry. Calm, controlled, a tone grounded in heartbreak, not anger. Andrew, he said softly, I taught you better. The words struck harder than any accusation. They weren't loud, they weren't sharp, but they were devastating. Andrew froze, tears suddenly welling in his eyes. He shook his head like he could outrun the truth closing in. No, Dad, you don't get it. I need it. He blinked rapidly, but the lies still came, reflex, habit, desperation. She told me it was the only way. I didn't mean to. You forced me to. His sentence broke apart, incoherent. The judge watched him with a stern, measured expression. Mr. Jennings, the judge said firmly, this court has serious concerns about your behavior. Continued dishonesty in these proceedings may result in criminal charges. Andrew sank into his seat, trembling, eyes darting between Walt, the judge, and the floor as if searching for some place safer to look. But there was no safe ground left. Blake sat back down beside Walt, exhaling slowly. The tide's turned, he whispered. He's losing his narrative. Walt didn't answer. He watched his son, broken, cornered, unraveling, and felt a weight settle in his chest. Not victory, not satisfaction. Just the solemn recognition that truth, once released, couldn't be put back in the box. And the consequences were only beginning. The sun had barely set when the pounding began, fierce, uneven blows that rattled the front door like someone was trying to break it off its hinges. Walt had just finished washing dishes, the soft clinking of plates replaced by the violent echo of fists slamming wood. He froze. He knew that rhythm. He'd heard it half a dozen times since the guardianship filing, the knocking that wasn't knocking, the pounding of a man who came demanding, not asking. He stepped toward the door cautiously. Through the window's edge, he saw Andrew swaying on the porch, his posture sloppy, his movements jagged. Even from inside, the stench of alcohol seemed to seep through the glass. Dad, Andrew shouted, slapping his palm against the doorframe. Open up, we're talking now. Walt didn't unlock it. Andrew, go home, you're drunk. Andrew laughed, a broken, bitter sound. Yeah, I'm drunk because of you, because you ruined everything. He slammed the door again, harder this time, rattling the pictures on the wall. You destroyed my marriage, he shouted. Do you hear me? You destroyed it. She left. She packed her bags and left because of what you did in court. Walt's heart tightened. Andrew, Melissa didn't leave because of me. She left because you found out who she really was. That's a lie, Andrew barked. You turned the judge against us. You made her look guilty, you. His words slurred into each other, anger melting into grief and then back into fury. Before Walt could respond, a car screeched to a stop outside. Headlights washed across the yard. A door slammed. Melissa. She stepped out wearing a tight coat, makeup smudged, eyes wild with a mix of rage and desperation. She stormed up the lawn toward Andrew, grabbing his arm. What are you doing here? She hissed. You're ruining everything. Andrew yanked his arm free. Me. You lied to me. You tried to sell his house without telling me. You were going to cut me out. Melissa's face contorted. You idiot. You were supposed to keep quiet. You were supposed to hold it together. I lost everything because of you, Andrew screamed. You lost everything because you're weak, she fired back. Their shouting escalated like gasoline meeting a flame. Within seconds, Andrew shoved her. Melissa shoved back harder. It spiraled into a frantic, messy fight, arms flailing, voices cracking, the kind of chaos that belonged in police reports, not suburban front yards. Walt stepped onto the porch, hands raised. "Stop, both of you, this isn't helping anything." Melissa turned on him instantly. "This is your fault, you manipulative old bastard. You want him to hate me." Andrew lunged at her again, stumbling, grabbing her coat. She slapped him across the face. He shoved her backward and she fell into the damp grass, screaming curses. At that moment, Carl Benton came rushing out of his house, phone already recording. "Hey," he shouted. "Enough, Walt, stay back." Seconds later, another car pulled up, Detective Doyle's cruiser. She stepped out fast, hand on her holster but not drawing, assessing the situation with the speed of someone who'd seen domestic violence unravel in seconds. "Enough," Doyle barked, voice sharp like a cracking whip. "Both of you step away from each other." Andrew stumbled backward, chest heaving. Melissa scrambled to her feet, hair wild, eyes darting like an animal cornered. Doyle pointed at Andrew. "You, hands where I can see them." Andrew complied, shaking. Then she turned to Melissa. "Melissa Jennings, step forward." Melissa scoffed. "Why, I didn't do anything, he assaulted me." Carl lowered his phone. "Detective, I got it all on video." Doyle didn't even need it. She looked Melissa dead in the eye. "We already have more than enough. The forged documents, the attempted financial theft, the break-in, the deleted recordings." Melissa's face drained of color. "You're under arrest for fraud and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult," Doyle said, reaching for her cuffs. "No, no, you can't do this, Andrew, tell her, Andrew." Melissa shrieked as Doyle pulled her arms behind her back. But Andrew didn't move. He just stood there, deflated, watching the only person he thought he could rely on being taken away in handcuffs. As Doyle guided Melissa toward the cruiser, Andrew suddenly pointed a shaking finger at Walt. "This isn't over," he said, voice ragged. "You hear me? A judge is gonna make this right. You can't just erase me. You'll regret this." Walt looked at him, not with anger, not even with fear, just a hollow sadness that settled deep in his bones. "I never wanted this, Andrew," he said quietly, "but you didn't give me a choice." Andrew blinked, his expression collapsing into confusion, grief, fury, none of it forming into anything coherent. He stumbled backward toward his car, hands trembling, eyes glassy. Carl stepped beside Walt, steady as a pillar. "You did what you had to," Carl murmured. Walt didn't answer. He watched the cruiser door shut on Melissa, watched Andrew sway beside his car, watched the remnants of his family fracture under the weight of their own choices. Heartbroken, but resolute. Because tomorrow, the legal fallout would begin. And this was only the final spark before the explosion. Walt sat in Blake Morgan's office again, the same mahogany table, the same framed law degrees, but the air felt heavier, thick with the aftermath of Melissa's arrest and the broken pieces of Andrew's unraveling. Blake had called him in urgently, asking him to come alone. No explanation, no hint, just a tone in his voice Walt had never heard before, something between gravity and apology. Blake closed the office door behind them, walked to his desk, and set down a slim, faded leather folder. It looked old, older than Blake, older than Walt's own retirement papers. The edges were worn, the leather cracked, as if it had waited decades to be opened again. "Walt," Blake said, pulling out the chair across from him, "I need you to sit." Walt did, slowly. Blake took a breath. "What I'm about to show you, your father intended for you to know eventually, but he asked me to keep it sealed until certain conditions were met." Walt frowned. "My father, Blake, Dad's been gone 40 years. "I know," Blake said, "but he planned for the long game." He opened the folder. Inside were documents stamped with dates from the early 1980s, bank statements, letters, account authorizations. Walt leaned forward, heart tightening as he saw the signature at the bottom of the first page. "Tom Jennings." His father. Blake slid the top sheet toward him. Walt, your father left you a second inheritance account, separate from the one you already received when he passed. Walt blinked, confusion clouding his face. A second inheritance. Why didn't I know about it? Because he didn't want Andrew to know, Blake said quietly. He feared what your son might become, even back then. Walt's breath hitched. Blake continued, voice gentle but unwavering. Your father asked me to keep this sealed until either you turned 70 or until Andrew displayed behavior proving Tom's concerns were justified. Walt stared at him, stunned. He predicted this. He predicted all of this. Blake nodded slowly. He wrote you a letter. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the corners. Walt recognized the handwriting immediately. His father's sharp, deliberate cursive. His throat tightened as he unfolded the paper. Walt, the letter began, you have always been a better man than me, patient, forgiving, generous to a fault. But your kindness could one day be your undoing. I see something in Andrew, a hunger for what he has not earned, a belief that what is yours is his by right. I pray he grows out of it, but if he does not, then this account is my protection. One day your salvation. Walt's eyes blurred. He kept reading. You must never tell him about this money. Not until he proves he values you more than he values what you leave behind. The words cut deeper than any wound Andrew had inflicted, because this wasn't recent. This wasn't sudden. This was a shadow his father had seen long before Walt ever knew to look. He lowered the letter, hands trembling. I failed him, Walt whispered. I didn't teach him right. I didn't correct him early enough. Blake shook his head softly. Tom didn't think you failed him. He thought you loved him more than he deserved. And maybe that was the problem. Walt closed his eyes, letting the grief wash over him. A grief not for the money, but for the decades of blindness, the years of hope that Andrew would become someone else, someone better. How much is in the account? Walt finally asked. Blake hesitated only a moment. As of last month's calculation, $3.2 million. Walt didn't speak, couldn't. The number didn't feel real, not because of its size, but because it represented his father's distrust, his foresight, his warning. A knock on the office door interrupted the silence. A court clerk stepped in, handing Blake a new envelope. For the Jennings hearing, sir. Blake thanked him and opened it. Inside was the judge's written notice regarding Andrew's petition. Blake scanned it, then looked up at Walt. He's barred. Walt blinked. Barred from what? From accessing any part of your estate, Blake said. Present or future. The judge says Andrew's behavior disqualifies him from serving as guardian, beneficiary, advocate, or executor, permanently. Walt felt something settle inside him. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, heavy finality. A door closing that he had spent years trying to keep open. But the news didn't reach Andrew gently. An hour later, Andrew burst into the courthouse conference room where Walt and Blake were reviewing filings. His face was flushed, eyes red from crying or anger, likely both. You hid money from me, Andrew shouted. $3 million. You kept that from me my whole life. Blake stood protectively between them, but Walt raised a hand. Andrew, he said quietly, your grandfather kept it from you, not me. Andrew staggered backward, shaking his head violently. No, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to shut me out. I'm your son. Walt met his gaze, steady, sorrowful, unwavering. And you tried to take everything from me. Andrew's face crumpled. You don't understand, he whispered hoarsely. I needed it. I thought it would make everything right. Walt let out a long, trembling breath. Money doesn't make a man right, Andrew. Character does. Andrew sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. He looked broken, not because of the money itself, but because the last thread of his imagined entitlement had snapped beyond repair. The judge's order lay on the table between them, a line drawn in ink, final and unquestionable. Andrew had no access to the inheritance, to the house, to anything. Blake closed the folder and looked at Walt. "This changes everything. You're protected now." Walt nodded slowly. For the first time, he finally saw it clearly. Not just who Andrew had become, but who he had always been. And who Walt needed to be moving forward. The courtroom battle wasn't over yet. But the power had shifted forever. The courthouse felt strangely quiet the morning Walt filed the no-contact order. Not hostile, not heavy, just quiet. As if even the walls understood what this moment meant for him. Blake walked beside him carrying a thin stack of finalized documents, but the emotional weight of them was far from thin. "You're sure you want this permanent?" Blake asked gently as they reached the clerk's counter. Walt nodded. "I've been sure for a long time, I just wasn't ready to admit it." The clerk reviewed the paperwork, stamped each page with a loud, decisive thud, and slid copies back across the counter. "Mr. Jennings," she said, "once this is processed, Andrew and Melissa are legally barred from contacting you in any form. Phone calls, visits, messages, anything becomes a criminal violation." Walt breathed out slowly. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was something closer to release, the loosening of a rope that had been wrapped around his chest for months, pulled tight by betrayal and heartbreak. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. As he stepped outside into the cool mid-morning air, clouds drifting lazily overhead, Walt felt the magnitude of the moment settle over him. He had severed the last tether. The legal war wasn't fully over, but the personal war, the one clawing at his heart, had taken its final blow. He climbed into his truck, dialed his phone, and waited for Blake to pick up. "Next step," Walt said, steadying himself. "Let's finish restructuring the estate." Blake's voice warmed. "Already prepared. When do you want to sign?" "T. Ode," Walt said. "I want everything locked down today." By afternoon, they were seated in Blake's office again, reviewing trust documents, inheritance allocations, and protective clauses strong enough to withstand any future attack, even 1 decade away. "I've divided the assets the way I want," Walt told him. "The primary estate stays in a protected trust, and the second inheritance that needs a different purpose." Blake nodded. "You mentioned charity." Walt looked out the window at the city below, people walking, living, struggling, surviving. "Yes, Martha always said money should help people who haven't had the breaks we did. I want part of the inheritance to fund scholarships, and part to support the youth center." Blake smiled softly. "She'd be proud of that." "And the rest," Walt continued, "goes into the long-term trust, accessible only if I approve it, no one else." Blake nodded. "I'll put everything in motion." Hours later, after the ink dried and the documents were filed, someone knocked on Walt's door just as twilight settled over the neighborhood. Carl Benton stood outside with a folder tucked under his arm and a determined look on his face. "We held a neighborhood meeting," Carl said. "People want you to know they're with you. You're not alone in this." He opened the folder and handed Walt a stack of letters, handwritten notes from neighbors up and down the street. "We've seen you walking your route for years. You're sharp as ever. We heard what Melissa did. We stand with you. Anything you need, Walt, anything." Walt scanned each letter, his throat tightening. He cleared it softly. "I don't know what to say." Carl smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you've got people in your corner." Walt set the letters carefully on the hall table, a testament to the power of chosen family. He felt something shift inside him, something warm and fragile, gratitude replacing despair, community replacing isolation. But the consequences for Andrew continued to ripple. 2 days later, Blake called with an update. Andrew's employer was notified of the ongoing investigation, he said. The forged documents, the financial exploitation attempt, it triggered mandatory reporting protocols. Walt closed his eyes briefly. What happened? He lost his job, Blake said, effective immediately. Walt didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. A father's heart doesn't stop caring just because the son fails. But he also felt no guilt. Andrew's actions had built this outcome brick by brick, choices made in greed, not desperation. After the call, Walt sat on his porch, letting the stillness settle around him. The wind moved through the trees with a softer voice than it had in months. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for footsteps, for pounding on the door, for another ambush. The world felt quieter. Later that evening, Doyle stopped by to check on him, her presence familiar now, steady. "You holding up?" she asked, leaning against the porch railing. "I think I am," Walt said. "Not all the way, but more than before." Doyle nodded. "The law's on your side now. Everything Melissa did, everything Andrew tried, it's traceable, documented, provable. And now that the no-contact order's in place, you have one less front to worry about." Walt exhaled. "I never thought I'd need protection from my own family." Doyle looked at him with compassion instead of pity. "Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who learn how to cut deepest." Walt turned his gaze toward the quiet street, where the porch lights of neighbors glowed warm and steady. "Do you think it's possible for life to feel normal again?" he asked. Doyle gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Not the old normal, but a new one, yes. And from what I've seen, you're already starting." She left him with that thought, and Walt remained on the porch, listening to the crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, the calm that now stretched uninterrupted. Peace wasn't fully here yet. But for the first time, it no longer felt impossible. The sky hung low and gray the morning Walt drove to the cemetery, thin winter clouds drifting like slow-moving ghosts over the Richmond hills. The kind of quiet that made every memory feel closer, sharper. He parked beneath the old maple tree Martha always loved, the branches bare now, reaching toward the sky like open hands. Walt walked the familiar path, his breath visible in the cold air. The cemetery wasn't a place of fear for him. It was a place of truth, a place where no one lied, no one demanded, no one betrayed. He stopped at Martha's gravestone, a simple piece of polished granite with her name carved cleanly across it. Martha Jennings, beloved wife, steady heart, 1949–2016. Walt knelt down, brushing a thin layer of frost from the stone with his glove. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered. The words trembled out of him. "It's been a while." He sat back, the cold seeping through his coat, but he didn't move. He needed her today, needed the silence only she could fill. "I messed up," he admitted softly. "I messed up as a father. I didn't see what Andrew was becoming, or I refused to see it." His voice cracked. "Maybe both." He looked at the stone, imagining her warm eyes, her patient smile, the way she used to rest her hand on his shoulder when he spiraled into worry. "I kept giving him the benefit of the doubt," Walt said, "even when the doubts were all I had left." A wind brushed past him, lifting a few dry leaves. He closed his eyes, breathing it in. "I tried to raise him right," he whispered, "but somewhere along the way something broke in him, and I kept blaming myself, even now." A tear slid down his cheek, surprising him with its warmth in the cold morning. "But I think I'm finally understanding what you always tried to tell me." He placed his hand on the stone. "I can't sacrifice myself to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." The truth of that settled inside him, painful but solid. He stayed with her a while longer, speaking quietly about the case, the no-contact order, Melissa's arrest, Blake's support, Carl's loyalty. He talked about the fear he'd carried, the shame, the betrayal. And then slowly he talked about the new things, the small shoots of life growing back through the wreckage. He stood only when the cold began to numb his knees. "I miss you," he whispered, "but I'll try to live in a way you'd be proud of." As he walked back toward the car, his phone buzzed with a notification. He hesitated before checking it. An email. From Andrew. Subject: Dad, please read this. Walt sat behind the wheel, staring at the glowing screen. For a long moment he considered deleting it unread, but something, perhaps habit, perhaps a lingering sliver of hope, made him open it. The letter was long. Pages of words, apologies, explanations, denial, regret, half confessions, half pleas. Andrew wrote about losing his job, about Melissa abandoning him, about shame, about mistakes, about how he felt confused, trapped, desperate. And then, near the end, I know I messed up. I know I ruined things, but I'm still your son. Please don't give up on me completely. Walt's throat tightened. He leaned back in the seat, letter open on the screen, his breath heavy. He read every word. And then he closed the email gently. He didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some wounds weren't ready to be revisited. Some bridges were too burnt to cross back over. He started the truck and drove away, leaving the message unopened emotionally, even if he'd opened it technically. Meanwhile, the consequences continued moving forward without him. Blake updated him later that Melissa was facing trial alone, fraud charges, attempted exploitation, falsifying medical records. Every protective instinct Walt once had for Andrew flickered as he imagined Andrew watching her be led into the courtroom in shackles. But that was no longer Walt's burden to carry. He had his own life to rebuild. And strangely, unexpectedly, a new path appeared sooner than he thought. It began with a simple invitation. The local youth center needed volunteers for financial literacy training. Doyle had mentioned it offhandedly during a visit. "You're good at numbers," she'd said. "And some of these kids, they've never had a stable adult teach them anything about money." Walt surprised himself by showing up. The first evening he stood in front of a room full of teenagers, fidgety, restless, cautious. He talked about budgeting, about saving, about respect for what you earn and what you build. And slowly he saw faces change. Eyes sharpen. Hands rise with questions. Afterward, one kid lingered. "Mr. Jennings," he said quietly, "thanks for explaining it without making us feel stupid." Walt smiled, really smiled for the first time in a long time. "You're not stupid," he said. "You just deserve someone who takes the time." He walked out of the youth center into the cool night air feeling lighter, steadier, not healed, but healing. Piece by piece. The cemetery visit. The letter left unanswered. The volunteering. The quiet return of peace. Life wasn't what it had been. But it was beginning again. And tomorrow, that beginning would continue. The morning sunlight streamed through Walt's kitchen window in a way he hadn't noticed in months, warm, clean, unburdened. He sipped his coffee slowly, the air carrying the quiet hum of a house finally returned to safety. No threats, no pounding on the door, no uncertainty lurking behind every text message. Today, he was signing the last of the documents that would officially open a new chapter of his life. Blake Morgan greeted him at the office with a firm handshake. "You ready?" he asked, motioning toward a neatly organized folder sitting on the conference table. "More than ready," Walt replied, taking his seat. Blake opened the folder and turned the first page toward him. "The scholarship trust is finalized. Funds are set aside, invested, and protected. It'll support local students starting next fall." Walt ran a hand across the page, imagining the faces of kids who'd walked through the youth center doors, kids who were hungry for direction, for someone to tell them they could climb higher than their circumstances. "Martha would have liked this," Walt said quietly. Blake nodded. "It's a beautiful legacy." The next stack of papers detailed the expansion of Walt's estate protections, multiple layers of legal armor, ensure no one, especially not Andrew, could ever try to seize control again. "You're protected from every angle now," Blake told him. "No loopholes, no backdoors. This is your life, your money, your decisions. No one touches a thing without your approval. For the first time in a long time, Walt felt something settle inside him, not just safety but authority. His own life was back in his hands, fully. When the signing was done, Blake closed the folder with a satisfying thud. "This," he said, "marks the end of their reach." Walt nodded, allowing the weight of those words to sink in. "Thank you for everything, Blake. I couldn't have done this without you." "You did more than you think," Blake replied. "You fought back. Most people freeze. You didn't." Back home, Walt turned his attention to the last lingering piece of vulnerability, his house. The one place that had been violated. He hired a security company to transform it from familiar and predictable into fortified and modern. New cameras, reinforced doors, motion sensors, smart locks, and an alert system directly connected to Doyle's precinct. When the installers finished, Walt stepped onto his porch and surveyed the property. The home felt different, not like a fortress, not like a bunker, but like a place he truly owned again. Later that week, Doyle stopped by. Not in uniform this time. Just jeans, a casual jacket, and a relaxed smile. "Thought I'd check in," she said, leaning comfortably against his railing. "Everything in place?" Walt nodded. "Feels like a new house." Her smile softened. "You know, I don't always get cases that end well, or people who come out stronger, but you did. You took the hits and kept standing." Walt chuckled lightly. "Didn't feel like standing half the time." "That's what makes it impressive," Doyle said. Then, after a pause, "You ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. You've got more family here than you realize." It was the kind of statement that didn't need embellishment. It sank into the quiet like truth long overdue. By the next week, with legal affairs complete and the house secure, Walt found himself doing something he hadn't done in months: walking. He stepped out just before sunset, the sky painted in soft oranges and fading blues. The neighborhood felt alive again, neighbors exchanging waves, kids riding bikes, Carl sitting comfortably on his porch with a book. Walt walked his old route, breathing in the cool air, the scent of fireplace smoke drifting from chimneys. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't scanning shadows. He wasn't checking over his shoulder. He wasn't wondering if Andrew's car would appear at the curb or if Melissa was lurking behind some imagined corner. He was simply walking, simply existing, simply free. The fear that once dictated every moment had faded, not erased, not forgotten, but quieted into something manageable, something powerless. As he reached the end of the block, he paused beneath a street lamp and looked up at the darkening sky. A sense of peace settled over him, not a grand revelation, not a triumphant victory music swell, just a steady, honest calm. Control was back in his life, stability in his days, purpose in his evenings. And though the past still lingered, the future felt open again. He turned for home, the night cool but gentle around him, unaware that the next day would bring something he hadn't expected at all. The house was quiet, quiet in a way that didn't sting anymore. Thanksgiving morning slipped in with a muted gray sky, the kind that made the world feel softer, slower. Walt stood in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, whisk in hand as he stirred a small bowl of gravy. No feast, no big gathering, no frantic preparation. Just a simple meal, roast chicken instead of turkey, a smaller pan of stuffing, green beans, and mashed potatoes made the way Martha used to, with extra butter and a pinch of nutmeg. He moved calmly, without hurry, letting the silence fill the gaps where tension once lived. The past months had aged him and sharpened him all at once. Today, he wasn't trying to outrun memories. He wasn't replaying courtroom scenes or arguments at his doorstep. Today, he was simply cooking. As the chicken finished roasting, Walt set the table for one